A scientist's discovery, meant to heal, becomes the spark for a chain of deaths, each more deliberate, more intelligent, and more cruel than the last. Within the walls of Nero Wolfe's brownstone, intellect clashes with corruption, and reason itself is put on trial. As Archie Goodwin tells it, the line between brilliance and evil has never been thinner. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. It was one of those Mondays that start badly and then keep their promise. The beer supply in the brownstone had reached a level of scarcity that would have made prohibition look prosperous, and Wolfe's temper was blooming in proportion to the deprivation. He had just finished his morning session with the orchids, 3 hours of cooing, lecturing, and moralizing to a room full of plants, and was now ready to resume doing the same to me. According to him, civilization was deteriorating because men had lost their reverence for precision. According to me, it was deteriorating because Fritz had forgotten the beer order and Wolfe refused to sign anything before noon. He ignored my observations with the serene indifference of a mountain to a mosquito. The air in the office was thick with the scent of orchid fertilizer and intellectual smugness. I tried opening a window. Wolfe objected. I tried sitting quietly. Wolfe spoke. It was the usual stalemate of philosophy versus practicality, and I was losing. Then the doorbell rang. Once, twice, and hard enough to make even Wolfe's eyebrows twitch. He grunted, which for him was an entire paragraph of curiosity. I went to answer it, already suspecting that whoever stood on the other side was about to make this Monday a memorable one. The door opened on a man who looked as though life had been pursuing him for several blocks and had finally caught up. He was small, pale, and carried with him a faint odor of ether, just enough to make you think of operating tables and regret. "Mr. Wolfe?" he asked, gripping his hat with both hands as if it might float away. "You'll have to settle for me first," I said. "Come in before you dissolve." He stepped in, blinking at the brownstone's civilized gloom. His suit had once been pressed, but had since lost the battle, and his tie was losing its own will to live. "Dr. Howard Kearns," he said, voice unsteady. "I was told Mr. Wolfe might see me." "Depends," I said. "We charge extra for shaking hands before noon." He didn't smile. The chemical smell followed him into the office, thin and persistent, as though he'd been steeped in his own experiments. Wolfe, behind his desk, turned his head slowly, assessing the man as he might a newly discovered fungus. No visible enthusiasm, but professional interest. I closed the door behind Kearns, already betting the day's non-existent beer ration that this visit would end in something other than gratitude. The man had the air of trouble wrapped in a lab coat, and from the way Wolfe's eyes narrowed, I could tell he smelled it too. The brownstone had just acquired its first whiff of danger, and of course, ether. I guided him into Wolfe's office, the way one escorts a timid substitute teacher into a classroom of delinquents. He was trying to smile, but his face wasn't built for the job. The man's hands fluttered like uncertain birds, and the gleam on his forehead suggested that nervousness was one chemical he produced in abundance. "Dr. Howard Kearns," I announced, which earned me a brief grunt from Wolfe, his idea of a social handshake. The doctor perched on the edge of the red leather chair, as if he expected it to reject him on moral grounds. His vocabulary, when it arrived, came out in phrases that smelled faintly of a laboratory: volatile reactions, controlled synthesis, and interference in equilibrium. Wolfe's eyebrows rose in slow agony, as though assaulted by a foreign dialect. When Kearns paused long enough to breathe, I filled the silence. "You're in safe territory, Doctor. Mr. Wolfe limits his experiments to the culinary field. Nobody's been poisoned yet." Kearns gave me a weak, grateful nod and pressed a handkerchief to his forehead. Wolfe, watching him with the patience of a cat studying a wounded sparrow, murmured, "Mr. Goodwin's attempts at reassurance are often as hazardous as your chemistry, Doctor. State your purpose. The man swallowed, his throat tight. I could tell we were about to hear the sort of story that doesn't stay in test tubes. It's gone, Kearns said, his voice trembling at the edges. My formula, months of research gone. Wolfe folded his hands across his vest, eyes half shuttered. Many things vanish, Doctor. Money, virtue, common sense. Specify. Kearns licked his lips. An enzyme compound, a synthetic catalyst that accelerates organic transformation. Revolutionary. He hesitated, watching Wolfe for a reaction. Wolfe offered him none. If developed properly, it could change the entire pharmaceutical industry. Indeed, Wolfe murmured, the word dry as dust. And you suspect someone stole it? I don't just suspect, Kearns replied. The original notes, everything, were removed from my laboratory drawer at the Manhattan Biochemical Institute. Only 3 people had access. Dr. Elaine Mercer, my research partner, Dr. Lionel Fisk, the Institute's director, and my assistant, Tommy Vale. They all deny it. I could see where this was going. And you want Mr. Wolfe to retrieve your missing miracle? Kearns turned to me, his eyes pleading. It isn't only the work, Mr. Goodwin. There were threats. I think they mean to ruin me, or worse. Wolfe's gaze didn't waver. A lamentable tendency of man to envy his own reflection. Continue, Doctor. But Kearns faltered, glancing toward the door as though afraid of who might be listening. When Kearns finished his recital, Wolfe closed his eyes and inhaled as though enduring the odor of inferior cheese. This, he said finally, is industrial whining, a modern affliction of the educated classes, theft, betrayal, competition, all born of a craving to monetize thought. Kearns blinked, uncomprehending. But I'm the victim here. Pfui. Wolfe's hand fluttered dismissively. You're the symptom, not the disease. You devote your intellect to concocting trifles that pretend to serve humanity, but serve instead the ledger. Archie Goodwin, peacemaker extraordinaire, intervened. Don't take it personally, Doctor. He delivers these lectures free of charge. Wolfe opened one eye at me. Silence, Archie. Your levity is an impediment to comprehension. Then to Kearns. You will find no comfort here, sir. If your grievance lies in industry, sue it. If it lies in conscience, cultivate it. I do not mediate quarrels among chemists. Kearns deflated visibly, like a balloon discovering physics. His hands, which had been clenching his hat, relaxed as though the effort were no longer worth it. I could tell he'd come hoping for salvation and was now watching it retreat into Wolfe's vocabulary. But even as Wolfe resumed his majestic stillness, I noticed something stubborn flicker in Kearns' eyes, a thought, or perhaps a secret he hadn't yet spent. I can pay, Kearns said, his voice rasping with sudden desperation. Not for sympathy, for help. He fumbled in his coat pocket and withdrew an envelope thick enough to make Fritz's grocery bills look modest. He placed it on Wolfe's desk as though it were a peace offering to an unpredictable god. Wolfe eyed it, but made no move. You are aware, Doctor, that I detest bribery disguised as honorariums. It's $5,000, Kearns said quickly, and there's more if you can help me. I've been followed, twice this week. They want the formula back, but I swear I never sold it. I watched Wolfe's eyelids flicker. Money might not stir him, but curiosity did. Who precisely is they? I don't know, but a man approached me outside the institute. He warned me to stop asking questions, said accidents happen in laboratories. I leaned back. Comforting fellow. Wolfe tapped his finger against the arm of his chair. Mr. Goodwin, the gentleman's paranoia appears well nourished, yet his anxiety may be informative. Kearns leaned forward, eager. Then you'll take the case. I shall consider it, Wolfe said, his tone suggesting the consideration would last a geological age. Leave the money, and any pretense that you understand your own peril. Kearns hesitated, then obeyed. The envelope rested on Wolfe's desk, like a small, silent challenge. Kearns rose, uncertain whether he'd been dismissed or postponed. Wolfe gave no indication either way. He was studying the envelope as if determining its moral composition. I escorted the doctor toward the door, doing my best imitation of a sympathetic host. He muttered half thanks, his voice the colour of defeat. But as he reached for his hat, I noticed something, a half-exposed envelope peeking from his breast pocket. The heading, in sharp black print, read, "The Vale Institute of Chemical Studies." I hadn't heard of it, but it didn't sound like a social club. "Doctor," I said lightly, "planning a second opinion?" He startled, covering the letter instinctively. "What?" "Oh, nothing. Just correspondence. A friend." He was a bad liar, and worse at pretending he didn't know it. I let it pass, but I filed the name away. When a man in trouble starts collecting secret stationery, it usually means the trouble has more pages to turn. He left in a hurry, the scent of ether trailing after him. Wolfe, still behind the desk, hadn't moved an inch. He merely said, "You saw it too, Archie." "Yep," I said. "And I'm betting it wasn't from the gas company." Wolfe grunted. "Then we shall see what chemistry makes of deceit." It was nearing 10 that night when I achieved détente with a sandwich. The city outside was humming its usual lullaby of horns and ambition, and I had just tuned the radio to the sports results when the announcer's voice shifted tone. Solemn, deliberate, the kind used for war bulletins and funerals. Dr. Howard Kearns, noted biochemist of the Manhattan Biochemical Institute, was found dead this evening in his laboratory. Authorities report apparent poisoning during an experiment. Further details forthcoming. The sandwich froze halfway to my mouth. I didn't need to look at Wolfe to know he was already looking at me. He never moved quickly, but when he did move, it meant something. "Well, Archie," he said quietly, "our visitor has completed his experiment, though not, I suspect, as he intended." I set the plate down, appetite retreating fast. "That makes your $5,000 seem unspendable." Wolfe's eyes gleamed, reflective as polished glass. "On the contrary, it makes it indispensable." He reached for his beer glass, as calm as if the man hadn't died at all, and added, "Fetch Kramer in the morning. I fear chemistry has proved itself a fatal art." And that was how the business of Dr. Howard Kearns began. Not with science, but with the stench of ether and the echo of a dead man's voice crackling through the radio static. Inspector Kramer chose his moments with the delicacy of a bulldozer. It was 10 minutes past 9, and Wolfe was deep into the ritual he treats with more devotion than mass. Breakfast. The menu was scrambled eggs with chives, rye toast, and Fritz's particular miracle of coffee. I was halfway through my own plate when the doorbell rang like the start of Judgment Day. Fritz answered it, and moments later, Kramer's voice rumbled down the hall, the sound of civic indignation wrapped in nicotine. He came in red-faced, chewing on an unlit cigar as if he meant to strangle it. In one hand, he waved Wolfe's business card, holding it like a warrant for blasphemy. "Your card," he barked, "was found on the corpse of one Dr. Howard Kearns." Wolfe didn't look up from his eggs. Then the deceased showed discrimination, if not longevity. Kramer's face darkened another shade. "You saw him, didn't you? Yesterday?" Wolfe dabbed his lips delicately with a napkin. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "if you would be so kind as to confirm that the inspector's tone is unsuitable for breakfast." I confirmed it. The atmosphere thickened like Fritz's cream sauce, and Kramer's scowl promised that no one's appetite would survive the morning unscathed. Kramer took 2 steps toward Wolfe's desk, the closest thing he'd ever get to a confessional, and planted his fists on it. "Don't play dumb. The man comes here, and 12 hours later, he's dead in his lab. That's not coincidence. It's Wolfe." "Pfui," Wolfe muttered, setting down his fork. If death followed every fool who came seeking advice, the population would have been decimated. Kramer's cigar made a furious circle in the air. "You talked to him. He left your card in his pocket." What did he want? Wolfe leaned back, composed as a bishop addressing a heretic. The man wished to engage my services. He failed to meet the terms required for retention. That is the extent of it. I added helpfully, meaning he didn't pay in advance, Inspector. That's Wolfe's version of celibacy. Kramer shot me a look that would have curdled fresh milk. You were in on it too, huh? I smiled. Only as witness and chronicler. You'll need someone to write the memoirs when you arrest the wrong person. Wolfe lifted an eyebrow. Archie. That was all it took. In our private Morse code, it meant shut up. Kramer snorted, still fuming. He's dead, and you're sitting here eating eggs. Indeed, Wolfe said. It is a meal, not a moral position. I could tell the inspector was about to burst something vital, and if I didn't move the conversation, we'd be repainting the office in arterial tones. The explosion came, but Wolfe disarmed it neatly. Inspector, he said, you may spare yourself further exertion. I am as ignorant of the man's death as you are of subtlety. However, that word froze Kramer mid-breath. However, Wolfe continued, since your department's methods will no doubt trample any evidence of value, I shall indulge curiosity. Mr. Goodwin will visit the Institute and retrieve the late Dr. Kearns's personal effects. That will, I trust, appease both our consciences. Kramer grunted. You mean you'll send him snooping? Wolfe's lips twitched. I rarely employ euphemisms, Inspector. If I did, I might say, observe, inquire, or redeem the honor of official incompetence. Fine, Kramer growled. But if your man sticks his nose in where it doesn't belong, that, Wolfe interrupted smoothly, is precisely where his nose is most useful. Kramer left with the dignity of a man who knows he's been outmaneuvered. As the door closed, Wolfe sighed and turned his attention back to the cooling eggs. Archie, he said without looking up, when you depart, wear your less conspicuous tie. I nodded. He was in motion again, the kind of motion that required no movement at all. By noon, I was standing in a laboratory that looked like it had been sterilized by angels with mops. Every beaker, burner, and flask gleamed under white light. The only blemish on the scene was a broken test tube lying near the central workbench, and the faint almond sweetness of cyanide hung in the air like an uninvited guest. A uniformed officer hovered near the door, guarding nothing in particular. When I showed him Kramer's authorization, he nodded me through with the enthusiasm of a lamppost. The late Dr. Kearns's workspace was as tidy as his personality hadn't been. No signs of struggle, no handwritten notes worth a nickel, just an orderly array of equipment that practically whispered, look elsewhere. I picked up the broken test tube with a pencil and sniffed the edge cautiously. The almond tang grew stronger. Cyanide, the laboratory's version of a farewell kiss. If it was suicide, Kearns had chosen his poison with professional flair. If it wasn't, someone else had done the mixing, and he'd been the experiment. I made a mental note. Wolfe would enjoy this one. It had the kind of precision crime that appealed to his taste for logic and his distaste for humanity. I didn't have to hunt far for company. The Institute's trio of resident minds was waiting in an adjoining office, lined up like a scientific jury. First, Dr. Elaine Mercer, tall, composed, and frosty enough to keep bacteria from reproducing. Her handshake was cool and exact, the kind that measured your worth in decimal points. Next came Dr. Lionel Fisk, the Institute's director, carrying his authority the way some men carry a paunch, prominently and without apology. He smiled, but it was the administrative kind, meant to obscure more than it revealed. Finally, Tommy Vale, the assistant, a young man with too much energy and too little self-control. His fingers tapped an invisible Morse code on the tabletop, nerves running on caffeine and fear. They spoke of Kearns in polite tones, each one disclaiming ownership of emotion. Mercer called him brilliant but erratic. Fisk, a regrettable loss to the field. Vale said nothing coherent enough to quote. In their faces I saw the same thing Wolfe often described in clients, the calculation of what the death changed, not what it meant. When conversation drifted to chemistry, Mercer's reserve thawed just enough to sound clinical. Dr. Kearns was testing compound H47, a catalytic variant, volatile under heat. He shouldn't have been working alone. Fisk interjected smoothly. He was aware of the risks. The Institute cannot be held responsible for personal recklessness. Recklessness. Mercer's tone sharpened. He was cautious to a fault. Vale twitched, his hands tightening around a pencil. He told me it worked. Yesterday morning. Said it was stable. Fisk's smile stiffened. A tragic miscalculation then. The board will issue a formal statement. I could tell the air in that room wasn't just thick with science. It was politics, fear, and maybe something combustible. Before leaving, I asked Fisk if Kearns had enemies. Only the usual professional ones, he said lightly. The kind that write glowing tributes when you're dead. He might have thought that was clever. I didn't. As I prepared to leave, Dr. Mercer handed me a folder of routine reports, her movements as crisp as if she were dissecting a frog. When she reached for a pen, I noticed a faint blue smudge on her cuff, chalk dust, fine and oddly bright. It didn't fit. Laboratories don't use chalk, classrooms do. Teaching in your spare time, Doctor? I asked lightly. She blinked, then looked down and brushed at the stain. Blackboard notes, she said. Dr. Fisk's office still uses one. Old habits die hard, I offered. Her lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. Especially bad ones. That, I thought, was worth remembering. I tucked the folder under my arm and thanked them all with the kind of politeness Wolfe says is wasted on suspects. As I left the institute, I glanced once more at Mercer's sleeve in memory. Chalk isn't much of a clue, unless it's in the wrong place. Back at the brownstone that evening, the air was thick with cigar smoke and disbelief. Kramer sat opposite Wolfe, declaiming like a prophet with a grudge. It's open and shut. Cyanide, isolated lab, no sign of anyone else. Suicide. Wolfe, seated behind his desk like a monument to reason, lifted his glass of beer with ceremonial calm. Inspector, you mistake simplicity for truth. Kramer glared. You've got something better. I have something different, Wolfe said. No man devises an enzyme worth $2 million, then kills himself before patenting it. He was murdered. The only question is whether the murderer understands chemistry or humanity. Kramer jabbed his cigar toward me. Your boss should stick to his orchids. Try telling him that, I said. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Archie, prepare a memorandum. I wish to examine all correspondence connected to Dr. Kearns, particularly anything bearing the name Vale. I nodded. He had already turned his gaze inward, the way he does when the gears of deduction begin to hum. Kramer huffed his way out, muttering about arrogance and lunacy. Wolfe merely said, Bring beer, Archie. The mind performs best when decently lubricated. And that was Wolfe, feeding logic while the rest of us tried to breathe. Inspector Kramer has a gift for timing. The kind you'd expect from a man who breaks doors for a living. It was precisely 9:23 in the morning, and Wolfe was midway through his breakfast, that sacred interval when the world is required to spin in silence. Fritz had just delivered the eggs, soft, delicate, seasoned to perfection, when the doorbell rang as if civilization had expired. Fritz tried to intercept, but there's no intercepting Kramer when his temper's on patrol. He came in like a storm looking for land, red-faced and clutching his hat as though strangling it might produce evidence. The unlit cigar clamped between his teeth looked ready to detonate. Your card, Wolfe, he barked, waving it like an indictment. They found it on a dead man, Dr. Howard Kearns. Poisoned. Care to explain? Wolfe didn't look up. He carved a deliberate bite of eggs and chewed with the patience of a saint at confession. Explain. To what end? If the gentleman is deceased, he cannot verify my account. Kramer's glare deepened. Don't get clever, Wolfe. That, Wolfe murmured, setting down his fork, would be superfluous, Inspector. I was born that way. The cigar twitched. I knew then that the morning's peace and the eggs were both officially ruined. Kramer's bulk filled the office doorway like an approaching avalanche. He jabbed a thick finger toward Wolfe. The man comes here, asks for you, then turns up dead the next day. You expect me to ignore that? Wolfe sighed, not from guilt, but from indigestion. I expect you to manage proportion, Inspector. The man did indeed call upon me, but he left with his heart beating, lungs functioning, and intentions unfulfilled. What happened thereafter is not my burden. You're dodging, Kramer snapped. He came for help. You refused. Now he's dead. I leaned back in my chair. You're assuming causation from correlation, Inspector. That's bad science and worse police work. Kramer's eyes flashed. You stay out of it, Goodwin. Try and stop me, I said pleasantly. Wolfe raised a hand, the universal signal for silence, or, in his case, divine intervention. Archie, let the inspector wallow in his hypothesis. It amuses him. Kramer's jaw worked like machinery missing a bolt. You're playing games, Wolfe, and one day you'll lose. Wolfe reached for his coffee. Perhaps. But until that improbable event, may I finish my eggs? I bit back a grin. Watching those two spar was like attending a symphony conducted entirely in insults. And Wolfe, as usual, held the baton. When Kramer finally stomped off, leaving a faint scent of tobacco and moral outrage, Wolfe dabbed his lips with a napkin and regarded me as though I were responsible for civilization's decline. Archie, he said, fetch your coat. I blinked. That sounded suspiciously like movement. Indeed. You will go to the late Dr. Kearns's laboratory and retrieve any personal effects worth examining. I raised an eyebrow. You mean Snoop? He scowled. If you must vulgarize my language, yes, Snoop, discreetly. I got up, already picturing the fun. And when Kramer finds out I've been tampering with his evidence, he will bluster, which is his métier. You will, as ever, survive. Fine. And what exactly am I supposed to look for? Evidence of intelligence, Wolfe said dryly. A rare element in both science and law enforcement. That was my cue. I left him to his orchids, his philosophy, and what remained of breakfast. Behind me, I could almost hear his mind sharpening like a blade, though, as usual, someone else would be sent to do the cutting. The laboratory was the kind of place that made you lower your voice out of respect or suspicion. It gleamed with the sterile perfection of a hospital corridor, every glass surface polished, every instrument aligned as though awaiting inspection by God himself. I signed the visitor's log, flashed Kramer's reluctant authorization, and got a grunt from the uniformed officer guarding the door. Inside, the air was thick with a faint, sickly sweetness. It took one whiff to recognize it: cyanide. I hadn't smelled that since high school chemistry, and it hadn't improved with age. The workbench was spotless except for a single broken test tube, its jagged edge glinting in the light. Someone had swept, but not well enough. A tiny shard glittered near the floor drain, and beside it, a faint smudge of something blue. Chalk, maybe. I pocketed my curiosity and kept moving. Whatever had happened here, it had been orchestrated by someone with precision, not panic. The whole place radiated a false peace, the kind that makes you suspect murder has recently cleaned up after itself. Wolfe would have called it an arrangement too tidy for nature. He'd have been right. I didn't have to chase interviews. They came to me, 3 of them, each more polished than the last. Dr. Elaine Mercer went first, tall, crisp, and cold enough to refrigerate milk. Her voice was pure laboratory, controlled temperature, precise dosage. Dr. Kearns was brilliant, she said, but careless with safety. His work on enzymatic stabilization was unprecedented. Then came Dr. Lionel Fisk, head of the institute, who entered like a man used to applause. A tragic loss, he declared, smoothing his immaculate cuff. But scientists know the risks of their trade. I nodded. Poison's an odd way to resign, though. He gave a patronizing smile. Accidents happen. Last was Tommy Vale, a jittery bundle of nerves in a lab coat. He stammered through. Answers, eyes darting everywhere but mine. I told him not to work late. He said he was close, that he'd cracked it. Cracked what? I asked. The formula, he said faintly. Compound H47. I filed that away. The way they said it, Mercer cold, Fisk smooth, Vale trembling, made me think it was more than just a chemical. It was a motive. Compound H47, Mercer repeated when I prodded, her tone suggesting I'd asked her to define water. A catalytic enzyme, volatile under heat, stable in theory. Dr. Kearns believed he'd perfected it. Believed? I asked. She hesitated. We hadn't verified his final test results. Fisk folded his hands like a man composing scripture. Dr. Kearns's enthusiasm exceeded his caution. His compound could revolutionize pharmacology, or bankrupt it. He may have realized that too late. Meaning suicide? I said. Fisk's eyes glinted. Meaning the pressures of genius can be corrosive. Vale shifted in his seat. He wouldn't have killed himself, he muttered. He said he was close. He said... Fisk cut him off, with a look sharp enough to sterilize glassware. That will be all, Tommy. Mercer busied herself with papers, avoiding everyone's eyes. I thanked them and left, wondering which of the three was the liar, or if all of them were telling their own carefully measured version of the truth. I was nearly at the door when Mercer reached to adjust her sleeve. That's when I saw it, a faint smear of blue on her white cuff. The same hue as the dust I'd noticed near the broken test tube. Chalk, not chemical residue. New fashion in lab work? I asked. Her head lifted, cool eyes narrowing. What? The blue smudge. Looks more classroom than chemistry. She followed my glance, brushed at it quickly. Oh, that. Dr. Fisk still uses a blackboard for formulas. I must have leaned against it. Of course, I said lightly. Fisk seems the blackboard type. Prefers erasable evidence. Her lips pressed together and she turned away. I didn't push further. Some things are better reported than resolved on the spot, especially when you're the outsider among three people who all have something to hide. I made a mental note to share it with Wolfe. He liked his clues like he liked his beer, peculiar, cold, and waiting to be opened. By evening, Kramer was back in the brownstone, looking as if he'd spent the day chewing nails and regretting the flavor. It's suicide, he said flatly. Lab full of cyanide, door locked, no sign of tampering. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, eyes half-lidded. An efficient conclusion, Inspector. Economical of effort, barren of sense. Kramer bristled. You've got a better theory? Wolfe's fingers drummed once on the desk. I have an observation. Dr. Kearns stood on the verge of patenting a formula valued in the millions. Men who expect fortune rarely poison. Themselves with such theatrical precision. Kramer's jaw worked. You can't prove murder. Nor can you prove intellect, Wolfe said. Yet here we sit, pretending both exist. I bit my lip to hide a grin. The inspector glared at me. One day, I'll have enough on you, Wolfe. Until then, Wolfe murmured, please refrain from contaminating logic with haste. When the door slammed behind him, Wolfe reached for his beer. Archie, he said quietly, fetch me everything you found at the Institute. The game, it seems, has chosen its board. And I could tell from his tone that sleep, for both of us, had just been postponed indefinitely. Wolfe had a way of declaring the end of an affair before the corpse was cold, and that morning was no exception. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded over the upper terrain of his vest, and announced with solemn satisfaction, the Kearns matter, Archie, is concluded. I was consulted, not retained. Ergo, I am absolved of further intrusion. That little Latin flourish was his idea of closure. Mine involved something more conclusive, like justice or curiosity. You mean, I said, we just sit here while Kramer fumbles his way toward another brilliant miscarriage of logic? He closed his eyes, signaling the conversation's termination. Mr. Goodwin, it is not my duty to compensate for the ineptitudes of the constabulary. I was engaged in dialogue, not in service. The distinction is critical. It's also convenient, I said. He grunted, which meant the barb had landed. But he was serene again within moments, content in his role as the immovable object that refused to meet the irresistible force. For Wolfe, disengagement was both a luxury and an art form, and for me, it was the kind of art that inspired mutiny. You can't spend years working for Nero Wolfe without learning two things. First, that he's the smartest man in any room, and second, that he'll use that intelligence to justify sitting in it forever. He called it prudence. I called it fear with better vocabulary. As he buried himself in his chair, I delivered the daily editorial. You know, one of these days, your devotion to non-involvement is going to choke on its own smugness. You can't solve crimes from the kitchen. Foy, he said, not even bothering to look up from his book. You mistake indolence for cowardice, Archie. They differ by genus. That's so, because from this angle, it looks like you're allergic to effort. He sighed. You are insufferable when moral. Bring me the mail. I didn't move. If you'd stop dissecting human folly long enough to notice it happening, we might prevent a few funerals. That one earned me a frown, an accomplishment I'd rate just below discovering radium. He said nothing, but the air in the room thickened with disapproval and unspoken retort. And then Fritz arrived with lunch, which, as usual, saved civilization. Lamb kidneys, in Madeira sauce, have a calming influence on Wolfe, like a lullaby with calories. Over the meal, he allowed conversation to resume. On his terms, of course. Ambition, Archie, he said between measured bites, is the most unstable compound in human chemistry. It corrodes faster than acid and intoxicates faster than alcohol. I poured his beer and took a sip of my own. You mean Kearns caught a bad case of ambition? He nodded. He pursued creation, not comprehension. A scientist who chases wealth is an alchemist. He transmutes intellect into vanity. That's poetic, I said. Too bad he's dead. He'd probably appreciate it. Wolfe ignored me. Man believes progress ennobles him. In fact, it merely furnishes him with more efficient tools for folly. The only antidote is restraint, a virtue modern intellect abhors. I raised an eyebrow. And you, naturally, are its last surviving practitioner. His glance was glacial. You mistake principle for abstinence, Archie. I abstain from folly, not from life. I let that hang in the air long enough to notice the faintest tremor at the doorbell. It was the kind of sound that promised to ruin digestion. Mrs. Lydia Kearns didn't knock twice. She entered like someone accustomed to being expected. Not welcomed, but inevitable. She was tall, immaculately dressed, and wore her grief like perfume. Deliberate, measured, and faintly artificial. Fritz tried to take her coat, but she refused with a smile that belonged to better times. Mr. Wolfe, I apologize for intruding, she said, stepping into the office with a composure that would have fooled most men. Wolfe inclined his head. Madam, you do not intrude. You arrive. She managed a nod, though her eyes flicked over the room with practiced calculation before settling on the desk. Specifically, the envelope Kearns had left behind. I've come, she said softly, because I believe my husband was murdered. That got Wolfe's attention. He didn't rise, of course, but his posture sharpened like a needle finding purpose. Sit down, Mrs. Kearns, he said. Begin. She did, with elegance, composure, and just enough tremor to suggest sincerity. But to me, it sounded rehearsed, and rehearsed speeches, in my experience, seldom tell the whole truth. My husband was no fool, Mrs. Kearns began. He was careful, too careful to make the kind of mistake they're calling an accident. Wolfe gestured for her to continue, eyes half-lidded but intent. She drew from her purse a small stack of typed pages, the top one smudged with chemical notations. These were his final notes. He warned me days ago that someone was watching him, that his formula was in danger. Wolfe accepted the papers without enthusiasm, turning them over once as though their weight alone might betray deceit. "You claim murder. On what evidence?" She hesitated. He said, "If anything happened, I was to find you." "That," Wolfe said dryly, "is sentiment, not proof." Her lips tightened. "Inspector Kramer is calling it suicide. You know it wasn't." That made him look up. Not far, just enough to register interest. "Why come to me now, Mrs. Kearns? Your husband came too late." "Because," she said, voice trembling now, "his work isn't gone. There's another copy, and someone's already looking for it." That landed with a weight heavier than the silence that followed. It was subtle at first, but I caught it. Every time Wolfe mentioned Kearns's death, Mrs. Kearns's face tightened. Every time he mentioned the formula, it came alive. Her eyes kept drifting to the envelope near Wolfe's blotter, the one Kearns had brought days earlier. When Wolfe asked whether her husband had spoken of enemies, she deflected toward his papers. When he asked about fear, she spoke of the formula's potential. Wolfe noticed, of course. He always notices. "You are anxious about your husband's work," he said, his voice smooth but cutting. "Not about your husband." She flushed. "I want justice for him." "Pfui, you want possession." Her composure cracked just enough to betray the truth. "You don't understand. That formula could change medicine. It's worth millions." "And has already cost one life," Wolfe murmured. Her gaze hardened. "Which is why it must not fall into the wrong hands." It was the wrong thing to say to the wrong man. Wolfe despised greed dressed as virtue, and I could see him growing curious, which, in Wolfe, was halfway to dangerous. For a long moment after Mrs. Kearns finished, Wolfe said nothing. His fingertips pressed together, his expression unreadable. I knew the signs. He was wrestling with his two great adversaries, indolence and intrigue. Finally, he exhaled. "Madam, your persistence is formidable. You have succeeded in transforming tedium into challenge." She blinked. "Then you'll help me." "I shall inquire," he said, as though the word help were beneath him. "If your husband was murdered, the facts will reveal it. If he was not, you will have your peace, such as it is." Her relief was audible. "Thank you, Mr. Wolfe." He inclined his head. "My gratitude is premature. Gratitude, in my experience, decays upon exposure to truth." She gathered her purse, but Wolfe raised a hand. "One more matter. You mentioned a second copy of the formula. Where is it?" Her answer was immediate, too immediate. "At my apartment, in a locked briefcase." Wolfe's eyes gleamed. "Archie, we must verify that." "Meaning," I said, "you're sending me into the lion's den?" "Hardly," Wolfe murmured. "More likely the scavenger's pit." Mrs. Kearns lived in one of those tidy Manhattan buildings that looked safer than they were. By the time I got there, safety had moved out. The door was open half an inch. Not enough to be polite, but plenty for trouble. Inside, the place looked like a burglar's resume. Drawers overturned, furniture shoved aside, papers scattered like confetti after a very unfestive parade. The briefcase, the one she'd described, was gone. Someone had known exactly what to look for and had left in a hurry. There was no sign of police, no neighbors hovering with questions. Just silence, stale perfume, and the faint scent of cigarette smoke that didn't match hers. I took a slow walk through the wreckage. Nothing personal had been touched. No jewelry, no valuables, no sentimental trophies. Only the papers, only the work. When I called Wolfe, he answered on the first ring. "Well?" he asked. "Your scavenger's pit," I said, "has been picked clean." There was a pause, then his voice, low and almost pleased. "Excellent. It seems the formula kills more efficiently than we thought, even without chemistry." And that was the beginning of the real trouble. There are few things sacred in my routine: coffee, eggs, and silence until at least 9 o'clock. That morning, I had achieved all three, which should have warned me the universe was planning revenge. The phone rang at 9:15. I gave it 2 rings before answering, mostly to register protest. It was Inspector Kramer's voice, tight as wire. "Tell Wolfe his scientific friends are dropping like flies. Elaine Mercer, dead. Cyanide in her coffee flask. Found an hour ago." I told him Wolfe was unavailable, which was true in every sense. Kramer hung up before I could inquire whether the department had suddenly decided to corner the poison market. Wolfe was upstairs with his orchids, and I considered letting him stay there. But news like that doesn't keep well, and I wasn't eager to watch him explode later for being left uninformed. I trudged up to the plant rooms and delivered the message. He didn't move. His fingers paused above a blossom, steady and deliberate. "Another one," he murmured. "Science appears to have acquired an unusually high mortality rate." The pause that followed told me he was already rearranging his day, and mine accordingly. By noon, Kramer was in the office, and the brownstone air pressure had dropped accordingly. He came in without waiting to be invited, slammed his hat on the nearest chair, and began, "Damn it, Wolfe. Every time you poke your nose into science, somebody ends up poisoned. What kind of game are you running?" Wolfe looked up from his book, managing to seem both offended and bored. "I do not poke, Inspector. I examine. As for murder, it appears to follow its own itinerary." Kramer jabbed a finger at him. "Elaine Mercer, cyanide in her coffee. That's 2 scientists dead inside a week, both of whom had dealings with you." "Incorrect," Wolfe said smoothly. "One consulted me, the other did not. My influence, alas, is not omnipresent." I stayed where I was, leaning against the wall, enjoying the exchange. Kramer was puffing like a locomotive, Wolfe as tranquil as a lake. It wasn't a contest, it was a tradition. "Listen, Wolfe," Kramer said, lowering his voice a notch. "If you're hiding something, I'll rip this place apart to find it." Wolfe lifted an eyebrow. "Please do. I could use the space." If sarcasm were gunfire, Kramer would have been riddled. Kramer was still pacing like an angry bull when Wolfe finally decided to speak in complete sentences. He set his book aside, reached for his beer, and said, "Inspector, you have my sympathy. The capacity for deduction must be a burden when unsupported by intellect." That landed about as well as a kick in the ribs. Kramer's colour deepened. "You think murder's a parlour game, don't you? 2 people dead, both with your name in their orbit, and you sit there quoting philosophy." "Murder," Wolfe said, taking a slow sip, "is not contagious by proximity. It spreads only through impulse and design. Neither, I assure you, are present here." Kramer's response was a word I won't repeat in polite company. I'd seen this act before. Kramer accusing, Wolfe dismantling, me trying not to laugh. The balance was perfect. Wolfe's calm wasn't feigned. It was weaponized. Finally, Kramer growled, "One day, Wolfe, I'll find a case that actually frightens you." Wolfe smiled faintly. "If such a day comes, Inspector, you will find me no longer at breakfast." Kramer stormed out, leaving the room smelling of tobacco and frustration. Wolfe looked after him with mild amusement and murmured, "Archie, our inspector mistakes noise for progress." By mid-afternoon, I was standing in Elaine Mercer's lab, doing what Wolfe calls retrieving facts and Kramer calls interference. The place was neater than any laboratory had a right to be. 2 coffee cups sat on the counter, one bearing lipstick, one not, beside a metal flask that looked innocent enough to have carried virtue instead of cyanide. The smell hit me first, sharp, metallic, overlaid with something sweet and bitter. Cyanide has a way of announcing itself. I'd have preferred a telegram. A lab tech hovered nearby, giving me the look people reserve for those who don't belong. I ignored him. Near Mercer's desk, a chair had been pulled slightly out of line, and a few papers fluttered on the floor, one with a half print of her heel on it. Kramer's men were still buzzing about, muttering theories. I left them to it. The room told its own story, one that didn't match suicide. Mercer's death, like Kearns's, had been executed with a chemist's precision, and an artist's sense of irony. When I left, I carried the image of those twin cups in my head, 2 vessels, 1 death, and a question Wolfe would undoubtedly insist on dissecting over dinner. Back at the Institute, I asked the night janitor to unlock Mercer's private office. He hesitated, muttered something about regulations, and yielded after I produced Kramer's note and a smile. The office looked ordinary enough, a desk, a few filing cabinets, and a smell of chemical residue that refused to fade. I went through the top drawer and found what bureaucrats fear most: evidence of meetings. A torn memo lay among the papers, half crumpled but legible enough to read. Meeting, Thursday, 9 p.m. Subject, distribution rights. Distribution of what? Compound H47, most. Likely, the magic formula everyone at the Institute whispered about. But the handwriting on the bottom edge wasn't Mercer's. Someone had signed their initials hastily. LF. I didn't need Wolfe to tell me that stood for Lionel Fisk, head of the Institute and professional eel. I pocketed the memo, locked the door behind me, and made a mental note. If Wolfe wanted to find the truth, we'd have to wade through a swamp of patents, egos, and ambition dressed in white coats. Wolfe heard my report without interruption, which was unsettling. When he listens quietly, it usually means he's rearranging the furniture in the universe. I went down the list. Fisk benefits from Mercer's death. Her patents revert to him. Tommy Vale was seen leaving the Institute late that night, and Lydia Kearns's alibi has more holes than Fritz's strainer. Wolfe's fingers tapped the armrest in a slow rhythm. So, 3 candidates: the usurper, the accomplice, and the opportunist. A fine representation of the species. You left out the category for the innocent, I said. He glanced up. Archie, innocence is not a classification. It's a hypothesis, usually unfounded. I gave him the torn memo. He turned it over once, raised an eyebrow, and set it aside. Thursday, 9 o'clock, he murmured. A meeting of minds, perhaps, and motives. You think Fisk arranged it? I think, Wolfe said, that people who discuss distribution rarely intend equality. That was his way of saying we were now knee-deep in profit and poison, and both, in Wolfe's experience, were equally lethal. After dinner, roast duck and an argument over portion size, Wolfe sat back and began the post-mortem of reason. 2 deaths, he said. Both chemists, both poisoned, both within a controlled environment. Tell me, Archie, what distinguishes these murders? Besides the corpses, I offered. He ignored me. They were not spontaneous acts of hatred. They were performances, the first framed as an accident in experiment, the second disguised as suicide. Both designed to deceive the unobservant and impress the intelligent. Meaning Fisk, I said. Meaning whoever admires their own intellect enough to stage morality as method, Wolfe corrected. These murders were not born of passion, but vanity, a desire to demonstrate superiority. He steepled his fingers, his eyes half closed. They are experiments, Archie. Experiments in death. The killer is testing not chemicals, but control. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Find who benefits, he added softly. But more importantly, find who enjoys it. That was Wolfe, making murder sound like art criticism. Kramer returned that evening, looking worn down, but still convinced he was right. It's over, Wolfe. Fisk's sticking to his story, Mercer's lab sealed, and the DA's satisfied. Suicide. Case closed. Wolfe didn't even blink. Then reopen it, Inspector, before someone else is inconvenienced by mortality. Kramer glared. You think you can do better? I can think, Wolfe said evenly. That is often sufficient. When Kramer finally left, Wolfe turned to me, his tone shifting from contempt to concentration. Archie, we've been peering at effects. We require the cause. Meaning? The formula, he said. Kearns's real discovery, not the copy paraded for investors. There were 2 versions, one genuine, one counterfeit. The latter killed him. The former is the reason others die. He leaned forward. eyes gleaming. Find it. Without it, we chase shadows. I nodded, though I knew what that meant. Long hours, no beer, and Wolfe tightening the screws on logic until something broke. And when it did, the next body on the slab might not be a scientist. If Nero Wolfe had a motto, it would be "Delegation is the highest form of wisdom." That's why I found myself navigating Lower Manhattan's Chemistry Row instead of him. A district that smelled faintly of solvents, secrecy, and overconfidence. Wolfe had sent me to inquire discreetly, which in his vocabulary meant dig until someone squeals, but do it politely. The shop I was after didn't advertise. It crouched between a publishing warehouse and a locksmith's office, its windows dusted with the residue of 1,000 quiet transactions. Inside, glass jars lined the shelves like a museum of temptation, each labelled in handwriting, too careful to be honest. The man behind the counter had the complexion of someone who'd spent too much time in fluorescent light and too little in truth. I introduced myself as a purchasing clerk on temporary loan from the Institute and asked a few innocent questions about stabilizers, reaction inhibitors, and why they cost so much for something you couldn't drink. He answered with the precision of a man used to lying by fractions. And though I smiled through it, my gut told me I'd come to the right place. We traded polite chemical gossip for 10 minutes before the conversation took a productive turn. I mentioned that our department head was experimenting with reactive toxins, and the supplier's eyebrows flicked upward just enough to betray recognition. "Ah," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "Then you may be referring to compound 47B, a stabilizer, quite rare. It has an interesting property, masks secondary reactions, prevents detection in most tests." He said it as casually as you'd mention the weather, but his eyes flicked toward a locked cabinet behind him. "A few grams were purchased only days ago," he added. "Unusual order, no specifications, paid in advance." "By whom?" I asked. He smiled thinly. "We're not in the business of betraying our clients, Mr. Goodwin," I supplied. "Nor am I. I'd just like to know who's keeping me out of work." He chuckled, but didn't answer. Still, the momentary pause told me enough. Someone connected to Kearns's circle had bought the chemical camouflage for murder, and I intended to find out which one wore it best. When charm reached its limits, observation took over. I leaned on the counter as if admiring the man's handwriting and casually glanced at the open ledger beside him. It listed transactions in neat columns, dates, quantities, initials, the polite footprints of dirty work. And there it was again, a faint smear of blue dust along the ledger's edge. Not ink, not powder, chalk. The same unmistakable shade I'd seen on Dr. Mercer's cuff and on the floor near Kearns's lab bench. It wasn't proof, but it hummed with the same rhythm as Wolfe's instincts when they started tuning toward revelation. The supplier noticed my interest and snapped the book shut. "Confidential records, Mr. Goodwin." "Of course," I said lightly, "but you might want to wipe your hands after handling them. Blue's a hard color to explain." He frowned, uncertain whether I was joking. I was, partially. That chalk wasn't from the chemistry trade. It was from an office, a blackboard, maybe a mind too clever for its own fingerprints. I left him to his unease, feeling the first real thread of this whole chemical tapestry pull taut. I was halfway to the door when the supplier, perhaps regretting his earlier caution, called after me. "If you do see Dr. Fisk," he said, "tell him the payment adjustment was accepted. I trust he found the terms satisfactory." I stopped just long enough to give him the kind of look that invites elaboration. None came. Fisk, Lionel Fisk, director of the Institute, administrator supreme, and professional dispenser of moral lectures. He was as clean as a sterilized beaker, at least on paper. But if he'd been here to adjust payment terms, it didn't sound like an academic matter. "Sure," I said easily. "I'll tell him, though he's usually not chatty about money." The supplier smiled vaguely, already regretting his slip. Out on the street, I let the cold air settle my thoughts. The blue chalk, the stabilizer, the payment. All lines converged on one man who'd made a career of controlling other people's discoveries. And now, apparently, their deaths too. It was time to take the news, and my suspicions, back to the brownstone. When I returned, the scent of coffee and cinnamon had claimed the kitchen. Fritz was performing his usual miracles, but what caught my attention wasn't the menu. It was the guest. Lydia Kearns sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking. Her eyes were red but dry, and her poise, the one she'd worn like armor last time, was cracking at the seams. Fritz looked relieved to see me. "She arrived without appointment, Archie," he said quietly. "Mr. Wolfe is occupied." I took one look at her trembling fingers and decided Wolfe would soon be unoccupied. "You came because of the papers?" I asked. She nodded, barely managing to speak. "I didn't know where else to go. Everything's wrong. They're watching me. I don't know who." The tremor in her voice wasn't all grief. It was guilt chasing fear around the same circle. I told Fritz to pour her another cup and went to fetch Wolfe. Whatever this visit meant, it smelled like more than sorrow. It smelled like confession. Lydia sat across from Wolfe, framed by the orderly chaos of his desk, a contrast so sharp it nearly told the story before she opened her mouth. He didn't rush her. He never does. Silence, in Wolfe's hands, works better than cross-examination. Finally, she spoke. "My husband wasn't only afraid of theft," she said, voice low. "He was preparing to sell the formula abroad, to investors in Zurich. He thought it was the only way to secure our future." Wolfe's eyelids rose a fraction. "Commerce in discovery, madam, is not sin. But theft under the pretense of patriotism is." Her lips trembled. "He said someone at the Institute found out, threatened to expose him. I think that's why he died." I watched Wolfe gesture subtly, a signal for me to keep her talking. "He made a second copy," she continued, "hidden somewhere. He told me I'd recognize it by the signature." "What signature?" I asked. She hesitated. "Not his. Someone else's." That single word, someone, changed the temperature in the room. Wolfe's eyes opened fully, and I knew the investigation had just shifted gears. When Lydia left, the office seemed to exhale with her. Wolfe remained still, gazing at the empty chair as though she'd left behind a residue of deceit he could analyze by sight alone. "Archie," he said finally, "do you know the one unforgivable crime in science?" "Bad arithmetic." He didn't smile. "Betrayal of intellect. To prostitute knowledge for profit, to reduce inquiry to barter. That is the true treason." He leaned back, his voice almost reflective. "Mrs. Kearns believes herself a widow of misfortune. In truth, she is a widow of consequence. Her husband's ambition outpaced his ethics, and she, poor creature, merely trails the fumes." I poured him a beer, the universal balm for moral disgust. "So what now?" He took a long drink before answering. "Now we watch. The scent of espionage is in the air, and like all volatile compounds, it will ignite with the smallest spark." He closed his eyes again, but it wasn't rest. It was calculation. And in that silence, I felt the case settle deeper into dangerous territory. Evening had folded itself neatly around the brownstone when the doorbell rang. I answered, expecting Kramer or another weary messenger from the NYPD, but it was a boy in uniform, carrying an envelope with Wolfe's name typed cleanly across the front. No return address, no stamps, just precision, the kind killers prefer. Wolfe slit it open with a paper knife and withdrew 2 sheets, one filled with a neatly typed chemical formula, the other bearing a single sentence. The third trial succeeds. Stop the fourth, or die. He read it twice, then handed it to me. "Well, Archie," he said, "our murderer appears to have adopted the habits of academia, publication before peer review." I studied the formula. "Looks genuine, or dangerous. Hard to tell which." "Both," he murmured. and now inevitable. He set the papers down, the note glinting faintly in the lamplight. The room felt smaller, as if the words themselves carried weight. Then Wolfe leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Archie, fetch the telephone. Intelligence has declared war, and it's using chemistry for artillery." The case, at last, had found its accelerant. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was in full cerebral bloom, that rare state when he moves as little as possible but burns enough energy to power a factory. The air in the office felt heavy with thought, which, in Wolfe's case, is more suffocating than smoke. "Archie," he said, "observe the symmetry. Kearns conceived the formula, pure intellect. Mercer sought to appropriate it, pure greed. Fisk contrived to bury it, pure power. 3 motives, 3 intellects, 1 corpse too many." I sat, because keeping up with Wolfe standing still is harder than running a marathon. "You're saying Mercer stole it, Fisk covered it, and Kearns got caught in the middle?" He closed his eyes. "No, I am saying Kearns created a discovery too potent to belong to one man. Such creations provoke theft the way nectar provokes wasps." He leaned back, templed his fingers. "But theft is crude. Suppression, that is artistry." That last word rolled through the room like thunder over a calm sea. I knew then we weren't hunting just a killer. We were chasing an idea that had learned how to kill. The cryptic note still lay on Wolfe's desk, its typed words as precise as a surgeon's incision. "The 3rd trial succeeds. Stop the 4th, or die." Wolfe's eyes lingered on it the way he might study a chessboard before a decisive move. "3 trials," he murmured. "Kearns, Mercer, Vale. The 4th awaits its subject." "Meaning another body," I said. "And probably not one volunteering." "Precisely. The writer of this note is either prophet or perpetrator, though I concede the professions are not mutually exclusive." He gestured toward the note. "It implies sequence, not randomness. Murder as method." That chilled me more than the words themselves. Kearns's death had been bad enough. 2 more, and we were slipping from civilized inquiry into slaughter. Wolfe lifted his gaze. "We must prevent the 4th, Archie. Prevention, alas, is not my métier. It requires movement." I smiled grimly. "And guess whose métier that is?" His eyes half closed. "Yours, my irrepressible Achilles heel. Find Tommy Vale." And just like that, I was back on the street, running interference for genius. Tommy Vale's apartment was the kind of place that gave optimism a bad name. The curtains were shut, the air stale, and the dishes in the sink had evolved from dirty to historical. No Tommy, no note, no sign of life except a fly with ambitions. I tried the landlady, who came equipped with curlers, curiosity, and the moral authority of 10 commandments. "He left last night," she said. "Had a visitor, though, a lady, grey hat, nice gloves. Not one of his usual kind." "Describe her," I said. She frowned, thinking. "Tallish, well-dressed. Looked nervous, paid the cab herself. I didn't need a sketch artist. Lydia Kearns, or her ghost." The landlady leaned closer. "He left in a hurry after she did. No suitcase, just his coat. I thought maybe they'd quarrelled." "Maybe they did," I said, "and one of them lost." I slipped her a bill for her troubles and left. Wolfe's phrase about the 4th trial kept circling my head. If Tommy was next, he wasn't just missing, he was marked, and someone had already drawn the chalk outline in advance. The cab driver was easier to find than the truth. A little persuasion and a few dollars got me what I needed. Tommy and the lady in grey had gone to the East River docks, then turned toward a fenced complex owned by the Institute. Old storage buildings, half abandoned, wholly uninviting. The place had the look of neglect pretending to be security. I found the gate unlocked, hinges whining like conscience. Inside, rows of rusted doors stretched into shadow. The air smelled of mildew, iron, and something acrid beneath. the kind of scent that clings to chemical ghosts. I moved slowly, boots echoing, nerves half a step behind. Wolfe's voice in my head. Observe. Do not intrude. But if intrusion is unavoidable, proceed intelligently. That's the trouble with Wolfe's advice. It assumes intelligence comes naturally. A faint light flickered from one of the back rooms. I followed it, thinking of Tommy's jittery hands and Lydia's anxious eyes. And before I reached the door, I already knew what kind of scene waited for me inside. Not life, but its aftermath. The smell hit first, sharp, metallic, and wrong. The floor glittered with fragments of glass, as though someone had dropped a constellation. Tommy Vale sat slumped against a work table, head tilted at a grotesque angle, eyes fixed on something beyond judgment. The vials around him had broken in a pattern too deliberate to be clumsy. A faint mist hung in the air, fading as the chemical fumes died. Whatever he'd inhaled had ended his story faster than any sentence could. I crouched beside him, taking in the details Wolfe would demand. The stains on his sleeve, the faint bruising on his neck, the unmarked label of a bottle tipped on its side. No struggle, no panic. Just sudden suffocation. It wasn't suicide. Tommy Vale didn't have the courage or the brains for theatrical death. Someone had brought him here, set the stage, and left chemistry to write the final act. I backed out slowly, lungs burning from the air, mind racing ahead. Wolfe had called it a performance of intellect and vanity, and this, I realized, was the encore. If fury had a face, Kramer's wore it that evening. He arrived before the medical examiner, barking orders at everyone in reach, then turned on me like a wolf on a leash too short. "Another one, Goodwin. You and Wolfe must be running a collection. Maybe you're saving them for Christmas." "Inspector," I said, "you should know better than to gift-wrap cyanide." He jabbed a finger an inch from my chest. "I warned Wolfe to stay out of this. Now there's a third body. You tell him from me." I cut him off. "Tell him yourself." I handed him the phone receiver. Wolfe's voice came through calm as ever. "Good evening, Inspector." "Good evening? You—" "Spare me the tantrum," Wolfe interrupted. "Coincidence mistaken for competence is an occupational hazard of your profession. I suggest you investigate cause before counting corpses." Kramer sputtered something unintelligible and slammed the receiver down hard enough to register on seismographs. I hung up gently after him. Wolfe, I thought, could probably insult a saint into sin. And Kramer was no saint. Kramer stormed out, dragging his temper with him, and the room settled into that quiet only the dead can hold. I crouched again beside Tommy, scanning for anything Wolfe could twist into deduction. That's when I saw it. Faint, almost invisible, on the inside of his wrist. A smear of blue chalk. Same hue as Mercer's cuff, same texture as the dust on the supplier's ledger. I brushed it gently with a handkerchief. It came away in a faint streak, dry and fine. Not laboratory residue, teaching chalk from a blackboard. The kind used in offices, not experiments. That made 3 bodies, one colour tying them all together. The pigment of intellect masquerading as innocence. I stood, letting the chill settle. Wolfe had once called murder a conversation between vanity and opportunity. Well, this killer had found the perfect medium. Chalk, the language of the learned. And I was starting to think the next message wasn't meant for the victims at all. It was meant for Wolfe. When Nero Wolfe announces a lockdown of intellect, it means 2 things. I'm the one fetching the mail, and civilization within a half-mile radius ought to brace itself. He sat in his chair like a monarch under siege, eyes closed, lips compressed in the way that signals the mind behind them is sharpening its knives. "Archie," he said, "we shall not leave this house until reason has vanquished subterfuge." That sounded noble, if you didn't have to live here. I've heard him declare wars on stupidity before, but this one came with a personal sentence. Confinement. No beer runs, no poker, no fresh air. Just Wolfe orchids, and the murder of 3 scientists hanging in the air like an odor you couldn't open a window against. Fine, I said. You besiege reason. I'll besiege Fritz's refrigerator. He opened his eyes, a slow burn of irritation mixed with confidence. Your levity, Archie, is a disease curable only by comprehension. Let us begin. And that's how I found myself both jailer and prisoner, waiting for logic to write its declaration of victory. Once Wolfe makes up his mind to end a case, the machinery of certainty starts humming. He leaned forward, pen poised, and began dictating invitations as though drafting royal summonses. To Dr. Lionel Fisk, to Mrs. Lydia Kearns, to Inspector Kramer, a demonstration of proof here, at 8 o'clock. I wrote them out, wondering how many would attend willingly and how many would come just to see Wolfe humiliate someone. When he paused for breath, I said, "You're really staging a parlor show." He gave me a look meant for insects. Demonstration, not spectacle. Precision must have its audience. There was a gleam in his eyes, the kind that means he's cornered the truth and is savoring the anticipation. Wolfe doesn't gloat, he marinates. Send them by messenger, he said. No telephones. Telephones dilute the gravity of invitation. I sealed each envelope, thinking how the words might feel to the recipients, polite, chilling, inevitable. The house felt different already, as if Wolfe's confidence had changed the air pressure. He was closing the circle, and somewhere inside it, a killer was about to suffocate. By evening, the brownstone had become something between a courtroom and a chessboard. Wolfe had arranged the chairs himself, or rather, directed me to arrange them with mathematical precision, while he criticized from behind his desk. 3 on the left, 2 on the right, equidistant, no aesthetic clutter, he instructed. He even had Fritz polish the beer glasses, not for refreshment, but for symmetry. The centerpiece of the whole arrangement was a small vial before each chair, neatly labeled Compound H47. Proof. I asked, "What's in them, Wolfe?" He didn't look up. An experiment in persuasion. That was Wolfe for you. He'd rather provoke panic than explain a plan. I checked the clock. 7:30. Kramer would arrive first, breathing brimstone. The others would follow, each carrying guilt in varying concentrations. When the preparations were complete, Wolfe leaned back and surveyed the room as though admiring a landscape he'd cultivated. "Archie," he said softly, "tonight, intellect shall perform its own autopsy." I couldn't argue. The place already smelled like judgment. They arrived in staggered waves, guilt, impatience, and officialdom. Kramer entered first, scowling hard enough to dent the wallpaper. Fisk followed, face glossy with forced calm. Lydia Kearns came last, all nerves and perfume, her hands twisting the strap of her handbag like it might confess first. I showed them to their chairs while Wolfe presided, immovable and almost regal. "Thank you for attending," he began, voice smooth, as if he were welcoming donors, not suspects. "You are here not for conjecture, but for demonstration. Murder, as it has been practiced in your midst, has a structure, and tonight it collapses." Kramer muttered, "If this is another of your lectures, Wolfe." "Silence," Wolfe said, without raising his voice. "You will hear the murderer speak, not in words, but in method." The room went still. Even Fisk's smirk faltered. Wolfe's tone had the calm of authority earned by certainty. From my post by the wall, I could feel it, the subtle panic that rises when truth enters the room uninvited. And Wolfe, savouring it, was just getting started. "Dr. Kearns died for intellect," Wolfe began. "Dr. Mercer for ambition, and Mr. Vale for silence. But the hand directing each was the same." He pointed toward Fisk. "Your institute, sir, fostered genius without ethics. You falsified data, created phantom tests, and painted your deception in blue chalk." Fisk's lips parted, but no sound followed. Wolfe went on, relentless. "The blue residue found on Dr. Mercer's cuff, on your assistant's wrist, and in your own office ledger, all from the same chalk used to sketch false results on your blackboard. You framed failure as experiment and used death to erase scrutiny. Lydia gasped softly. Kramer leaned forward, expression sour but intrigued. You will note, Wolfe said, how your so-called alibis rely on performance. You positioned yourself as the observer, never the participant. But Dr. Fisk, only the guilty orchestrate order with such zeal. Fisk tried a smile. That's conjecture, Wolfe. Pfui, it is mathematics. The silence that followed wasn't disbelief, it was recognition. Wolfe's voice dropped to a measured cadence, lecture, sermon, and indictment all at once. The chalk, gentlemen, contained cobalt, a catalyst accelerating cyanide's decomposition. Dr. Fisk employed it to disguise the poison's presence, converting homicide into laboratory misadventure. Kramer frowned. You're saying he engineered every one of them? Precisely. He altered the experiments, ensured each reaction mimicked the previous accident. Dr. Kearns's formula became both weapon and disguise. Wolfe gestured toward the vials before them. Each bears the same mixture, harmless, unless combined with arrogance. Fisk's composure wavered. You can't prove that. Wolfe inclined his head. On the contrary, your own chalk residue, analyzed, confirms cobalt traces. And your presence at each experiment, conveniently delayed, conveniently documented, betrays orchestration, not observation. Lydia whispered. So it was never about money. Wolfe's eyes flicked toward her. No, madam. It was about power. The dead sought truth. He sought control. The room was silent. The performance was complete. Only the curtain awaited its cue. Fisk stood abruptly, chair scraping against the rug. This is absurd, he shouted. You can't condemn me with parlor tricks and chalk dust. Sit down, Kramer barked, but he was already pacing. The tremor in his hand betrayed more than anger. You've been quite thorough, Mr. Wolfe, he said, forcing a laugh. Perhaps you'd like a demonstration of my own. He reached for one of the glasses prepared on the table, his own, and lifted it defiantly. Wolfe's eyes didn't move. You prepared that glass earlier, Dr. Fisk, with the same compound you used on others. You sought to dramatize innocence through risk. A mistake. The catalyst remains. Fisk froze, then sneered, half mad. You bluff. He drank. For an instant he smiled, victorious. Then the smile faltered. The glass slipped. His breath caught, staggered, ceased. Even Kramer didn't speak. The irony hung in the air. The man killed by his own proof. Wolfe exhaled softly. The intellect, untempered by conscience, invariably devours itself. No one contradicted him. No one dared. The medical men came and went. Lydia Kearns left pale and silent. Only Kramer lingered, chewing on the bitter root of justice. He stood over Wolfe's desk, hat in hand, scowl slightly softened. Well, he said finally, your formula works. Wolfe inclined his head. I told you, Inspector, the chemistry of truth is irreversible. Kramer grunted. You ever try applying it without a corpse? An admirable ambition, Wolfe said. But progress requires reaction. That ended the conversation. Kramer put on his hat and walked out, muttering something about mad geniuses and miracles. I closed the door behind him and turned to Wolfe. Satisfied? He sipped his beer, considering. Satisfaction, Archie, is a vulgar emotion. Let us settle for correctness. I nodded. Fine by me. I'll settle for dinner. He allowed himself the ghost of a smile. A more practical philosophy. And with that, the brownstone fell quiet again. Justice served, intellect appeased, and the faintest whiff of victory curling through the air like the scent of orchids after rain. The brownstone, after a case, always feels like a convalescent ward. Silent, overfed, and slightly smug. Fritz was humming again, which meant civilization had returned to its natural orbit. He'd even resurrected the soufflé schedule, a sure sign The apocalypse was behind us. The orchids, too, had reclaimed their dominion upstairs, and Wolfe, relieved of criminal distraction, treated them as priests might relics, reverently, obsessively, and without conversation. For my part, I was reacquainting myself with the art of boredom. The phone rang for deliveries instead of deaths, and the only thing threatening Wolfe's digestion was Fritz's insistence on variety. He'd survived Fisk, Kearns, Mercer, and their collective chemical melodrama without lifting more than a finger, or, to be precise, a syllable. Peace had resumed its tyrannical rule, and I almost missed the racket. Almost. Because in our line of work, quiet doesn't mean safety. It just means Wolfe is about to start thinking again. And that, as experience proves, is the first warning tremor before the next earthquake. It began, as such sermons always do, over beer. Wolfe had finished his second bottle with the solemn satisfaction of a man completing a sacrament. Then came the sigh, that deep, resonant exhalation, which means philosophy is about to replace digestion. "Archie," he said, "intellect is a divine gift, but like all gifts, it invites perversion. Fisk and his cohort misused it, not for discovery, but for dominance. Murder by formula. It is the corrosion of intellect by precision." I was used to these symphonies of disapproval. Wolfe never raised his voice. He simply let logic accumulate until morality looked small beside it. "They mistook measurement for meaning," he continued. "Their minds, once instruments of inquiry, turned inward, sterile, meticulous, self-consuming. When intellect devours conscience, the result is murder, dressed as method." He poured another glass and stared into it. "Men who think too much and feel too little, Archie, should not be permitted to mix chemicals or theories. They invariably poison both." I left him to his reflections, wondering whether that last jab was aimed entirely at Fisk. I decided the atmosphere needed a little less Greek tragedy and a little more Goodwin. "If we're handing out warnings," I said, "we might as well patent your process while we're at it. The Wolfe method. Guaranteed to kill egos in 30 seconds or your money back." For a moment nothing happened. Then the corner of his mouth performed the most delicate twitch since the dawn of civilization. Wolfe's smiling is like an eclipse, brief, blinding, and proof the universe occasionally indulges whimsy. "Pfui," he murmured, "you mistake rigor for vanity." "Sure," I said, "but vanity sells better." That earned me a full glance, which in Wolfen currency is applause. "If you ever tire of detection," he said, "you may find a calling in the demoralization of scholars." "I already practice part-time," I told him. He made a noise, somewhere between disgust and amusement, then retreated into abstraction, that familiar distance where thought outpaces conversation. The silence afterward felt almost affectionate, like the pause between chess moves that both players know will decide the game. When Kramer shows up uninvited, you can tell the case has tied itself neatly enough to irritate him. He arrived that afternoon, without a cigar, always a bad omen. I let him in, and Wolfe greeted him with his usual cheer, meaning none at all. "It's done," Kramer said. "Fisk left a full confession before the coroners took him. Lydia Kearns is under federal hold. Espionage and conspiracy. Nasty mess." Wolfe nodded once, as if the universe had merely confirmed his prior opinion. "You have my condolences, Inspector. Bureaucracy will dine well on the corpse." Kramer scowled. "You make it sound like we enjoy cleaning up your deductions." "Not at all. You tidy the physical, I attend to the metaphysical." That almost earned Wolfe a homicide charge of his own. I watched Kramer's jaw work, then relax. "Anyway, you were right. Again, I hate that." "Of course you do," Wolfe replied mildly. "It affirms order." Kramer grunted and left. I closed the door behind him, half expecting it to slam itself. The brownstone seemed to exhale, smug, serene, and ready for its next victim. Kramer's departure left Wolfe staring into the middle distance. which for him is the equivalent of a moral monologue in slow motion. When he finally spoke, it wasn't about Fisk or Lydia or justice. It was about contamination. "Archie," he said, "the law can punish, but it cannot disinfect. Fisk's offense was not murder, it was vulgarity, intellect prostituted to profit." I waited. When Wolfe condemns vulgarity, the world itself should take cover. "To use reason as a servant of avarice," he continued, "is the basest corruption. The stench of it offends beyond legality. Men like Fisk degrade intelligence into commodity, as if thought were merchandise to be weighed and sold." He leaned back, face tightening. "Such men pollute civilization more thoroughly than crime. At least crime retains passion. This mechanized deceit has none." I didn't argue. You don't debate theology with the priest. But I couldn't help thinking that somewhere deep down, Wolfe's disgust was personal. He'd seen too many brilliant men waste their genius, and perhaps feared, in his more honest moments, how close intellect can come to arrogance. Evening settled over the brownstone with that quiet, heavy dignity New York sometimes remembers to wear. I sat near the window, watching the last streaks of daylight fade, and wondered aloud, 3 people dead over a discovery meant to save lives. There's irony for you. Wolfe didn't open his eyes. "There is inevitability," he corrected. "Men have always preferred dominion to advancement. Power intoxicates. Progress merely nourishes." "Still," I said, "Kearns wanted to heal the world. Did he? Or did he wish to be worshipped by it?" Wolfe's tone was soft, almost indulgent. "The line between altruism and vanity is no wider than a molecule, Archie. One misstep and the noble becomes monstrous." I poured myself a beer, letting the bubbles do the thinking. And here I thought chemistry was a clean science. Wolfe gave a snort. "Nothing involving men is clean." Outside, the city kept humming. A patient with a chronic condition, neither cured nor dying. I wondered how many more cures would be lost to the same disease Wolfe had just diagnosed. We'd reached that late hour when the city grows philosophical, and even Wolfe's orchids seemed to listen. I closed the file on my desk and said, mostly to fill the air, "There's no formula for murder." Wolfe raised an eyebrow, the slow, deliberate gesture of a man correcting history. "Nonsense, Archie. There's always a formula. Only the variables differ." I looked at him, amused. "Meaning humanity supplies the measurements?" He took a slow sip of beer. "Precisely. Greed, fear, pride, in proper proportion, they yield the same result every time. Chemistry without conscience." I couldn't help smiling. "If you ever publish that, remind me to keep my fingerprints off the cover." Wolfe closed his eyes, satisfied. "I publish nothing. I merely observe that the human compound remains stubbornly unstable." The clock ticked. The orchids perfumed the air, and Fritz's footsteps sounded faintly from the kitchen. The world, such as it was, continued in equilibrium, and as I turned out the light, Wolfe's words lingered, like the aftertaste of truth you can't quite wash away. In the quiet that follows justice, the brownstone breathes again. Its rooms filled not with suspicion, but with the faint scent of orchids and reason restored. Yet beneath Wolfe's calm and Archie's wit lingers a truth no formula can dissolve. The human mind, once bent by pride, can turn discovery into destruction. Was it intellect that killed, or the vanity that wears its mask? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Sometimes, even the sharpest minds can't escape the shadows of the past.